Absolutely. Because if we start to see, if we address those issues early on, a therapist can come in and say, hey, you know what? I can show you how to do this better, or I can show you how to do this safer, or let's work on strengthening. Now, I showed the difference between rehabilitation and habilitation. And I'm not here to say that any person with dementia can't participate in rehabilitation in the traditional sense. We still can strengthen muscles. We often say muscles don't get dementia, right? They can still get stronger, but the overall model is still habilitation. And so we want to, once again, maximize those abilities in the moment. And so if you notice any changes in movement, you can get a physical therapist before the disaster occurs to hopefully prevent it from occurring.
You're listening to Parent Projects, a family media and technology group production. Now here's your host, Tony Siebers.
Well, on today's show, again, friend of the show, Adria Thompson from Be Light Care Consulting. She is a language pathologist turned expert in dementia care. She is a practitioner within the field and is really a go-to practitioner for us, for the show, and for where we point families to help get their arms around this in a way that's filled with joy. Adria, I'm ready to dive right in. Thank you for joining us again today on the show.
Thanks. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm excited to dive in.
Awesome. Well, I love doing that. Okay. Well, look, I think most of us have seen, if you're not familiar, you look down in the show notes and you'll see some of the other shows and conversations that we've had in the past to really open up kind of how you came into doing this. But your family situations led you to really focus and find a love in teaching other people and families about dementia and how they care for that and how to tackle that challenge just the step by step, like the day in punch in the nose, I think that comes at families, and you do a great job doing that. Today, you're going to break down the difference between rehabilitation and habilitation and things that we could think about when we're trying to determine how to help a loved one, maybe recovery from something, or maybe they've had an injury and they're trying to come back to the house. We're trying to stabilize something. Where should we get started against that? What are some of the first principles to think about? Maybe the difference.
Yeah. Yeah, let's start there because I think it is a misconception when we start thinking about rehabilitation or therapy for someone with dementia. As a speech language pathologist myself, I have heard from family members, well, honey, like dad has dementia, so he can't get any better. So I don't think he can benefit from therapy. So it's understandable, right? For family members or friends to not really understand how we can rehabilitate someone if they have a disease that gets worse over time. And totally understandable. So, I want to lay out the difference between rehabilitation, which is the classic model that we all know and are aware of, versus something you haven't maybe heard about, which is called habilitation. Okay, so to explain rehabilitation, I'm going to use my husband as an example. He actually broke his foot last year during a water balloon fight, which is really interesting and tragic, of course, but it was a very fun time that turned bad very quickly. But he broke his foot, and from that moment on, everything changed, right? Before that broken foot, he had a set of skills and abilities that included loving to play basketball, loving to go run, go to the gym, and go on walks in the evenings with me. He broke his foot, which is the condition, the event, the thing that happened that changed everything. And on the other side of that is a new experience for him, which is having deficits, right? He's not able to be as active, to not participate in those fun things that he loved to do. And so, what rehabilitation does is they say, okay, we see those skills and abilities he had before the event, which was the injury, and we want to recover those skills. If he was playing basketball before, we know he's fully rehabilitated if he can play basketball again. And so that's the model that we are familiar with, is getting someone back to what they were doing before.
Right.
But I'm sure, Tony, you probably can see the problem here when it comes to dementia is, are we really getting someone back to what they were able to do if they have dementia, right?
Right, and particularly because any effort, it seems, of change or movement or injection of stuff has really got to be worth it, because we see just degradation. It seems like every time you touch it, it gets a little bit worse, right? So I am all ears at listening at the next step of this, because I need this hope.
Yeah, yeah. So, regardless of the type of therapy, which we can kind of break down next in this conversation, but regardless if it's physical, occupational, speech therapy, for someone with dementia, there's complications, right? When they may not be able to participate in a rehabilitation process like my husband can, who is fully, as far as we are aware, cognitively intact, right? So, the model that best works for individuals with dementia is something called habilitation. What habilitation says is okay, yes, there were abilities and skills that someone had. Then there was an event, an illness or an injury. And so, if we use it in the context of dementia, we have dementia setting in, right? Whether it's diagnosis or just the slow process of realizing something is different. And on the other side of that, instead of looking back to those skills and those abilities that they had before, what we do is say, okay, this is the new normal that we're living in. This is where we are in the process of their life. We're not necessarily going to be concerned about what they could do before as far as the specific skills. What we're going to do now, instead of restoring or recovering, we're going to maintain and retain abilities for as long as possible. We want to maximize skills for as long as possible. So if you look at someone with dementia and they've maybe had a broken hip, it might not be possible that we get them back to all the things that they were doing before. But what we want to do is take the skills that they have now and maximize those, compensate for them, adapt, all these therapy words that we use a lot of times, which is basically just providing the right level of support around someone so that we can keep them in the best shape possible for as long as possible.
That's great. Some of the other aspects that you've talked about in as dementia sets in, like first things in, first things out, or other
Mhm.
concepts of where people forget. It sounds like too there's almost an assessment for where they would be, so you can pick that. If technology is gone, then we're not going to lean on technology for habilitation. We're going to roll back and get an understanding of maybe where they sit out. Am I kind of picking up where this is what you're throwing down with this?
Yeah, exactly. We're not gonna always just be looking back to 3 months ago, 6 months ago, well, they used to be able to. What we wanna do a lot of times with dementia is just to say, "Okay, well, where are we at now?
Okay.
What skills and strengths do they have now that we can focus on?" Because it's very easy to look at someone with dementia and make a list of sometimes, like, the things that they can't do anymore, and that's not what therapists are in the business of doing. We have to do that sometimes for insurance purposes, for documentation purposes, to assess what someone can't do. But more than anything, we want to look at what they still can do and how can we use that to their benefit. And that's what I find most inspiring about my job. And that's, I think, what sets us apart sometimes from other medical providers and why we're an essential part of the team.
Yeah, without a doubt. Okay, so we taught in habilitation, there's a couple of different ways to kind of break that down, right? Or different streams of which that plays into. Can you talk us through, the difference of where physical might sit versus occupational therapies, or all the different types of therapies, and what we
Yeah.
how does this play out within that?
Yeah. So there are three main types of therapy when we talk about rehabilitation or habilitation services: physical, occupational, and speech therapy. So it might be helpful just to kind of delineate what those are and what they do.
That'd be great.
First, being physical therapy, that's usually the one people know most naturally because we might have had experiences with that during our lifetime. But physical therapists, for the most part, are experts in movement. So typically, that's walking, but it also can be propelling a wheelchair, perhaps any kind of movement of the entire body, gross motor movements, range of motion, stability, making sure that someone has good balance, having good strength. They assess all of those things. They can also assess and treat pain, especially if it's chronic or acute. They can help with pain. They can recommend assistive devices, like if someone needs a walker versus a rollator versus a wheelchair. They can provide a lot of assessment and strategies for keeping safe in your environment. So maybe you need to remove throw rugs or modify things a little bit. And they can also train caregivers. If we do have to be hands on with someone and provide some physical support, physical therapists are great to come in and teach a caregiver how to do that in the safest way possible for both the person that they're caring for and for themselves, because injuries are a big problem.
Boy,
So
that
physical therapy, just that umbrella, is that they do a lot.
yeah, that absolutely. There's a ton with that, and I love that you talked about too, even just learning how to do that or use like a walker. I remember even
Mhm.
having it, in a younger age for me, had a back surgery and I had to use a walker. And there's a way to use a walker. I mean, you think you know how to use a walker until you learn from a physical therapist how to use a walker, and you're like, oh, guess that makes sense. But these are
Yeah.
just things you really don't know until you know, and it's glad to know that that's where that might sit. Okay, so there's
Mhm.
habilitation models for that physical
Mhm.
therapy.
Yeah,
Uh,
so physical therapy, yeah, they can do rehabilitation in the traditional sense, but they can also provide habilitation services as well.
Love it.
Yeah. The next would
Occupational.
be occupational. Yeah. So occupational therapy, they mainly deal with what's called activities of daily living. And so when we think of occupations, a lot of patients will say, "No, I don't need a job," but that's not what they're there for. Occupations are the things that we do every day that keeps us functional. So showering, dressing, going to the bathroom, brushing your teeth. And they also help with instrumental activities of daily living, which I think we've talked about before, which is the more complex things like medication management and driving and paying bills. They are also great with fine motor movements. There are some occupational therapists that are hand specialists. OTs are also awesome with adaptive equipment. So having all these like products that are really cool to help you do those things in an easier way. They always have like the coolest gadgets. I love being around them. Much like physical therapists, they can provide environmental safety recommendations, caregiver training, and they help a lot with addressing cognition, which will be an overlap of speech therapy that we'll talk about next. But occupational therapists are awesome, and they're super functional, as you can imagine, with those ADLs.
Brilliant. And they bring the toys. Love it.
Yes, they bring the toys.
And the last category.
Yes, the save the best for last. I might be a little biased because I am one, but speech language pathology or speech therapy are the same terms. It refers to the same thing and the same people who do it. As a speech therapist, we help with three different areas: communication, swallowing, and cognition. So communication is not only receptive language, but expressive language. So it's understanding and speaking. We have swallowing, which is often not thought of when it comes to speech therapy, but that's if someone has any difficulty with anywhere from chewing to all the way it emptying into the stomach. We help with all of that, recommending diets and re-strengthening those skills. And then cognition is an overlap with OT, but we can assess, diagnose, and treat difficulties with memory, attention, problem solving, language, and so forth.
Okay, because not all of that is going to be dementia related. There's some of those
Mhm.
strengths that are just natural and innate to us. It sounds like
Yeah.
as human beings. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are some of the top things so when is a family member going to be evaluating rehabilitation or habilitation or
Mhm.
get preparing to have that conversation? Generally, when do you think we would be interacting or having that conversation?
Unfortunately, most commonly, therapy does not enter the conversation until there has been some kind of disaster, right? If someone has fallen at home, they have a hip fracture, they go to the hospital, they've been in the bed for 2 weeks, and then they're having to go to a skilled nursing facility, perhaps for rehabilitation. And that's where therapy enters the picture. And there absolutely, we have a role there. And I want to expand everyone's thinking here that also therapy, physical, occupational, and speech therapy can also be extremely helpful for preventative measures. So if you're at home or even if your loved one is in a care community and you're starting to notice some changes in the way they move, in the way they interact with the environment, in the way that they take care of themselves, in the way they communicate, if you're noticing those changes, you have every right and ability to request therapy referral from their primary care physician. And it's completely, for most people, especially under Medicare, a lot of these services are completely covered. And so it's not a really expensive thing for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And that's super, super helpful.
Yeah, I think specifically of families that we've seen where gait is starting to change or maybe changing kind of quickly, and they got to learn how to get up, and maybe the bedroom is upstairs. That's a part of it, and they're trying to stay in that home as long as possible. So, therapies, does that come down to some of the physical therapies, learning different ways to walk better or to work with gait ahead of time? Is that what we're talking about to fix into?
Absolutely. Because if we start to see, if we address those issues early on, a therapist can come in and say, hey, you know what? I can show you how to do this better, or I can show you how to do this safer, or let's work on strengthening. Now, I showed the difference between rehabilitation and habilitation. And I'm not here to say that any person with dementia can't participate in rehabilitation in the traditional sense. We still can strengthen muscles. We often say muscles don't get dementia, right? They can still get stronger, but the overall model is still habilitation. And so we want to once again maximize those abilities in the moment. And so if you notice any changes in movement, you can get a physical therapist before the disaster occurs to hopefully prevent it from occurring.
Without a doubt, especially because we see such an impact when, our loved one has to go into a hospital, or, even for the littlest thing, it seems like an overnight stay in the hospital is a kickoff to a lot of additional things. So avoiding those little trips seems to be something that can really be valuable for us. How about on the occupational side of the house? What are some instances, or when a family's starting to deal with that, or might notice there's going to be a value to some occupational habilitation? What might that manifest, and what could they do about it?
Yeah, so if you're starting to see that the person you're caring for is having more difficulty, especially with showering, that's typically one of the friction points for a lot of people with dementia. So whether it's not wanting to, that could allude to the fact that they are finding it too complex. We take for granted how difficult some of these simple things we do every day. I mean, how many times are you in the shower and you're like, wait, did I already wash my hair or not? We do it so routine that it's second nature. But for someone with dementia, it still requires a lot of thought process. And so they might start avoiding some of these tasks like getting dressed or showering because the complexities are starting to be too overwhelming. And so if you see that they're having difficulty participating in those tasks, you can get an occupational therapist involved to kind of say, hey, how about we simplify this? Let's remove everything from the shower. Let's use a whiteboard marker and write on the walls to help remember the steps. There's all kinds of really creative things we can do.
Absolutely love that. Absolutely love that. Within the confines of even our own situation there, or where they are in within the home. In actually, that maybe is an assumption. Occupational therapy, the therapist can come to the home where mom's living, where dad's living, right? And just walk through in that environment. We don't have to wait to have to go to someplace else to do that.
Yeah, there are some stipulations for eligibility. For example, if a therapist comes into the home, typically it's considered home health therapy. And so the eligibility there is there has to be a noticeable change that's documented. So you have to go to your doctor and have them physically write out those changes that we're noticing that you're describing. And the person has to be considered homebound. So what that means is not necessarily physically homebound, like they can't physically leave the house, but I think the phrasing is it takes a concerted effort or a taxing effort to get them out of the home. And if they have dementia, that can even be cognitively, right? Like you have to keep your eye on them. You can't just, take them anywhere because they might wander off. And so if you can document that it's easier to stay home than go out and they have a change, then typically under most insurances, a person will qualify for home health therapy. And yeah, a therapist can come in their home.
Love that. In fact, there's a whole You think of a whole nother show that we can go on that in piecing those things together for families that are working. I think one other context to set too is when we talk about those restrictions or these special like isms, we're talking about the different payer models that might be out there, right? So that's if you're on a Medicare payer model, or if you're using insurance, some Medicaid or a supplemental Medicare policy, or even private insurance. And some maybe they've got a spouse that's younger than them that is still on health insurance and working that. That said, the truths of what you're talking about and having somebody come in and work with habilitation in the home ahead of time seems to outweigh enough. It might be your family might want to just think about this and think about developing a cash payer model in order to, especially of keeping mom in the Alamo as long as possible, is a part of what your parent project is. It's something that you guys want to do. Thinking through that, it is great to understand how to work through the isms of how we're going to pay for it there, but nothing should take away from the fact of you're laying out great ways that we can get in front of problems ahead of time. I'm loving this. I'm loving this. Let's jump into speech. Let's
Yeah,
go
so
ahead.
a speech problem that might be great for a speech therapist to get into the equation about is those differences in language that you're noticing. So if someone is having difficulty thinking of the words they want to say, or maybe they are avoiding social opportunities because they feel like they can't perform as well as they did, speech therapists can come in and provide. One of the coolest things that I love to do is provide what we call like a vocabulary wallet or a notebook. And so for some people who have difficulty thinking of specific words, maybe they love wine but they just have the hardest time thinking of Chardonnay, which might be their favorite. I love creating lists of commonly used words. We might have in their wallet a list of their favorite drinks or a list of their grandchildren's names that they can pull out in a discreet way to be able to reference to avoid any embarrassing situations, because that repetition can help them. So there's those little things. I'm not necessarily recovering those skills of thinking
Right.
of the word we want to say, but we're supplementing them in a way that's functional.
Which is giving them that ability to continue participating in
Yes,
society as long as possible, and hopefully staving off the isolation that might come with them, drawing back down or becoming, homebound in some way, shape, or
absolutely.
form. I
Mhm.
Absolutely brilliant. What are some other things that families should think about here, just as we're kind of landing the plane here in the
Mhm.
use of habilitation over rehabilitation?
Yeah. So the biggest thing is don't wait for a disaster to get help. There is help available to you. Like you said, because there's different payer models, different states have like slightly different rules as far as home health therapy goes. So it's hard to make general statements about exactly how things work, but just know that there's likely a therapist available to you that can provide not only support to the person you're caring for, but support to you to better understand what's going on, have a better perspective about it. And I delineated the difference between physical, occupational, and speech therapy, but I need you to know that it's not up to you to determine what your loved one needs. You might say, hey, I'm having a hard time getting them off the toilet. I don't know if that's physical or occupational therapy. That's okay. You don't have to know, because in most cases, if you have a home health therapist come into your home, there are physical occupational therapists who work for the same company. They can both assess your loved one and they determine whose expertise is the right fit for the situation. So it's not up to you to figure out all the details. Just ask for help, and then they can use their magic and their skills to figure out what the best solution is.
Brilliantly said, and again delivered with amazing hope. Adria, where can our listeners find more information on you and Be Light Care Consulting?
Yeah, you can go to belightcare.com. You can email me at info@belightcare.com, or you can find me on any social media platform, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at belightcare.
And I will throw out a plug like I commonly do. You want to do that. You need to connect with Adria out into social media. Not only are you going to learn gems and walking through, and watch your poor husband. I mean, which is just, it's an awesome thing. But man, you genuinely do. You throw some light, a little bit of hope into these difficult situations. I can't thank you enough for, again, being on the show and coming to share your time, talents, and treasures with us in the audience.
It's always great to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
Well, that's it for the team this week, and thanks for joining us. If you've enjoyed the content, remember to subscribe and to share this episode on the app that you're using right now. Your reviews and your comments, they really help us expand our reach as well as our perspective. So if you have time, also drop us a note. Let us know how we're doing. For tips and tools to clarify your parent project, simplify communication with your stakeholders, and verify the professionals that you choose, you can find us on YouTube, follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks again for trusting us. Until our next episode, behold and be held.
Thank you for listening to this Parent Projects podcast production. To access our show notes, resources, or forums, join us on your favorite social media platform or go to parentprojects.com. This show is for informational and educational purposes only. Before making any decisions, consult a professional credentialed in your local area. This show is copyrighted by Family Media and Technology Group Incorporated and Parent Projects LLC. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcast.